Lando Norris of McLaren-Mercedes had this race in the palm of his hand. It was right there. It was right there. And then the rain came. A little bit like yesterday in qualifying when Mercedes was slow to switch to the intermediates because they were at front, they were in the commanding position. It was kind of the same for Lando in the McLaren. It's very easy when you're sitting here after the race to comment, perhaps to criticize, hopefully to be objective and to be positive always, if one can be. It's very easy to say, oh, well, they should have done this, they should have done that. I would say right now, if I'd been on the pit wall at McLaren, I would have said, stay out there. And I think Lando did exactly the right thing. Of course, it didn't result in the win that he should have got. But in the situation he was in, it was definitely worth the risk. Because let's face it, satellite predictions aren't always accurate. And although Mercedes was saying the rain is going to get worse, Lewis, you've got to come in, and they were insisting upon it. And although on this occasion they were absolutely spot on, correct to do so, there is always that slight doubt. And if you're leading the race as you are with Lando Norris, you just don't want to let go. You don't want to let go of a win that you think you can maybe massage through in the last lap or two on slicks in the wet. Well, it didn't work out, and eventually Lando did have to come in much too late. By then the race had gone. But rather than just talk straight off the bat about Lewis and his 100th win and how well he drove and how well Max Verstappen drove from the back of the grid. That was the podium, Lewis, Max, and then Carlos Sainz. Let's just talk a little bit more about Lando because this was everything we'd kind of suggested yesterday. It was never going to be easy to pass a McLaren if you were Lewis Hamilton. And Lando Norris, for all his misgivings about being on the pole and what was going to happen and the quicker cars behind him, absolutely had a chance to win the Russian Grand Prix, as we said yesterday. More than a chance. He had the race won. It was just a superb drive. Both Lando and Lewis, of course, started on the medium tyre. They switched to hards. And the hard was a good tyre because Max Verstappen, who started from the back of the grid, as predicted on the hard tyre, found that the medium was not a great match for the Red Bull Honda in the second phase of the race, which was a surprise. You'd imagine on a lighter fuel load that the medium would be good. But it wasn't. Even got passed by Fernando Alonso on the road. But that's another story a little bit further into the video. Let's get back to that battle between Lando and Lewis. Virtually the same conditions. Lando's tyres a little bit newer than Lewis's, and we're able to see them out there on a clear track. Lando under pressure from Lewis Hamilton. What was he going to do? Of course, Lewis had the quicker package, and yes, he brought an 8-second lead down to 1 second. But at that point, and with about 10 laps to go, Lando was just superb. The only visual difference on track, as I said in Austria, is if you measure those white stripes and the red stripes they have on the curbs here in Russia, about the distance of one red to another was the distance that Lewis, generally speaking, was turning in earlier to 90% of the corners. Some of them you line locked and it wasn't evident. But that is where Lewis has that slight difference. Let's call it a difference in style if you want to. Not necessarily better, although I do think shorter corners are the way to go, always have done. Less road to travel apart from anything else. Lewis was always coming in a little bit earlier than Lando. But in terms of everything else, the roundness of Lando's inputs, the finding areas where he get the car, change of direction and under heavy braking, just outstanding, no mistakes at all, under incredible pressure from Lewis Hamilton. And as Lewis said after the race, it was really going to be a mistake from Lando, or perhaps something happening in traffic, the slower cars as they were passing them, that was going to give him the opportunity to win the Grand Prix in the dry. And that says everything. As I said, it's evidence that the McLaren-Mercedes, give or take a few variables, is right there with the factory Mercedes team and Red Bull Honda. And it's also that Lando Norris is almost a Lewis Hamilton clone. Just superb to watch. And I was wondering whether, when Lewis was following him, whether he was thinking, oh, this is a little bit following myself. This guy really knows how to drive. And for me, that was one of the great moments of this 21 season so far, watching those two drivers and watching Lando under that sort of pressure, doing what he did. Just brilliant. He finished 7th in the end because of that late stop for intermediates, but it doesn't really matter, does it? I mean, this race was Lando Norris, and he was fully entitled when Lewis was doing his interview afterwards for the world feed to ambush it and give Lewis a hug because, this was the race, wasn't it? This was the race where Lando Norris, as a result of finishing second to Monza, not pushing Daniel, even though he could have, doing a great team job, released from that is, he was just wonderful to watch. And so did Lewis. Yeah, I mean, he did a very, very good job. The early laps were always going to be fraught. There was lots going on, particularly between the Alpines going into the first corner, and Lewis backed away. And I guess here, you have to say, apart from being an incredibly patient driver when it comes to getting into a corner and never rotating the car before he knows it's the perfect moment, the moment where there's the least possible downside for doing so. He never covers that with early throttle or anything like that. He's always there waiting. Apart from that, Lewis, very, very good at being patient in a race now. I mean, that's what we're seeing with this driver who's now won 100 Grand Prix, 7 World Championships. He can pace a race beautifully. Quite early on, you would have said, well, Lewis' race is gone. He's being held up by all sorts of people. Carlos Sainz and Lando Norris pulling away in front. How can Lewis possibly do anything? But of course, things always change. He started on the medium and switched to the hard. And on this occasion, the hard tyre was a great tyre to be on in the second half of the race. And Lewis took maximum advantage from that. Fastest lap after fastest lap, catching Lando, very, very good in traffic. And at one point, Lewis got on the radio to say, pace is pretty good, eh? Just to say, wow, this is going well. Not often you hear drivers like that. Equally, Lando, just as voluble on the radio, saying things like, the car feels great, I can't believe it. I think probably we've got more tyre degradation than showing, but I've got a clear track in front of me. The balance is still good. Wow, it's still going. It was just like listening to an excited kid in his first race. And that's what this race was all about. It gave us this personality of Lando Norris against the sagacity of Lewis Hamilton and how well he drove that race. And it's ironic, of course, that in qualifying, having come in late for the intermediates, that on this occasion, Mercedes did get it absolutely right. Lewis came in 1 lap after Max Verstappen. And it was that extra lap that Max had on the tyres that gave him that ability to vault from the high midfield, where he'd been kind of trapped all race, particularly when he was on the mediums in the second half, as I say. But on the intermediates, Max was just brilliant as well in the wet, using all sorts of line, finding the grip. And Lewis, who came in, you could argue, maybe 1 lap too late. Nonetheless, it was easily enough for him to win that race, while Lando was running straight on in braking areas on the slicks and running wide and almost spinning to a halt, but he kept the thing going, as I say, to finish 7th. So dramatic little cameo at the end there where everybody was out on intermediates in the wet, I think the last 2 laps, that is. And it was interesting to see the wet weather times they were doing there. Who was actually quickest in the wet? Well, actually, he had nothing to lose, really, but Valtteri Bottas did a 51.2, Lewis did a 51.4, Max a 51.8. But the other driver who was really quick in the wet right at the end, even though he came in too late for intermediates as well, was Fernando Alonso in the Alpine. He eventually finished 6th overall, a really well-deserved 6th. So as defining as the wet was right at the end of the race, let's have a look at who stopped and when. The first 2 to come in were Valtteri Bottas and Kimi Räikkönen, and Kimi had a very good end to the race as well, finishing 8th. They were followed in a lap later by Max Verstappen, Carlos Sainz, Daniel Ricardo, Lance Stroll and Nikita Mazepin, and then Lewis. So you can see how late Lewis did come in, but it was just enough to win the Grand Prix. Max said afterwards that the intermediate was right on the edge in Sector 3, which was the driest of the 3 sectors, and had almost reached the end of its life there. So you could argue again, I suppose, that Mercedes made the perfect call for Lewis Hamilton on this occasion. And you don't say that lightly, because it's a really difficult call to make. When the driver's out there saying, it's not that wet, it's not raining, it's not that wet, and you're thinking, yeah, Lewis has got a lot of ability, more than most, obviously, and if it is just a light drizzle of slicks on a drying track, then maybe we should leave him out. But they were absolutely adamant that it was going to get worse, and they were correct, and they brought him in. So on this occasion, 100% full marks to Mercedes. The team should take as much credit for this win, I think, as Lewis, because that was a great call right at the end. I think what Lando did was actually typified his drive today. He overperformed in many ways, and that valiant drive at the end was just a signature of that overperformance. Carlos Sainz finished 3rd, but what an amazing start to the race for the Ferrari driver. Belting down into the first corner, everybody in top gear. It was really, really closely matched, and Carlos just made perfect use of every gap around him. He had Lewis right next to him, no matter at all, just went straight down on the outside. And Lance Stroll too, really good in that early traffic binge down into the first corner. But Carlos it was who took the lead from the outside of Lando Norris going into turn 1. Lando doing exactly the right thing there, thinking, yeah, I'm not going to brake too late. I'm going to leave a little bit of margin, and we'll see if anybody tries to pass me if they make it. And of course, Carlos did. But after a while, it was pretty clear that the McLaren was doing a better job with its medium tyre than the Ferrari. I don't know whether it was game playing or what, but at one stage, Lando got on the radio to say, my fronts have gone, my fronts have gone. And 2 laps later, he set fastest lap. And at that point, Carlos Sainz was sinking like a stone. So if it had the effect of making him stop early, thinking that Lando was going to do that as well, then it worked perfectly for Lando and McLaren. Actually, I think what happened was that Lando did a very good job of cleaning up the graining on the front tyres. The tyres had started to grain after 5 or 6 laps, and it's very, very difficult actually to get rid of graining. Fernando Alonso, I just think it is the worst thing you can have on a racing car. But Lando backed away, got out of the slipstream, if that's the right word. The debris is probably a better word. And he just looked after the front tyres, and he found grip again. Carlos Sainz drove very well. He struggled a little bit when the hard tyre was new, but once that had cleared out as well, he was really quick in the closing stages of the race. There was a point where the radio said, looking like a top 5 finish, Carlos, and he got back and said top 5, and that was good to see. Very different from the way he handled, for example, the Hungarian Grand Prix. He was one of the first drivers to get on the radio when the rain started to fall, just specks of rain, to say get the soft tyres ready as well as the intermediate. So very good thinking there from Carlos to get on top of his crew to let them know how he was thinking, and he benefited from an early stop for the intermediate. So very, very good drive by Carlos all round. Well managed drive, particularly off the line. Just fabulous off the line from a dirty side of the grid as well. Daniel Ricciardo finished 4th in the other McLaren-Mercedes. A typical Daniel Ricciardo drive. Nothing dramatic about it. No risk-taking extraordinaire, but he was always there taking advantage of situations, particularly the right call towards the end of the race. And very good off the line as well. Daniel is just so good off the line into first corners these days. It is what he does so well. And he was really crowding the likes of Lewis going into turn 1, and was one of the drivers that got ahead of him purely as a result of just being aggressive, but not too aggressive in the braking area into turn 1. So very nice drive from Daniel as well. And he won't mind too much that this was Lando's day, because Daniel had his win at Monza. That he will still be glowing from that win. And from McLaren's point of view, a 1-2 at Monza and almost a 1-4, would have been a 1-5, I guess a 1-5 in Russia. So a very, very good piece of momentum for McLaren. It's just such a shame, just to reiterate the point, because it is what this race will be remembered for. It's such a shame that Lando didn't get that result, but it'll come, that's for sure. Valtteri Bottas was an uninspired 5th in the Mercedes. He started from near the back of the grid as well, as a result of a strategic engine change made, a decision to change the engine on Saturday night, which gave him that grid penalty. But it was 15th place grid penalty, qualified 7th, but he actually started P16. And that is because a lot of other penalties meant you had to start from the back. So there were a lot of penalty holders behind him. And as good as the call was to make that engine change, to drop Valtteri back in front of Max Verstappen, and perhaps to give Lewis a little bit more room to breathe at the front of the grid, because the last thing he would have needed would be Valtteri coming in front of him into the first corner or something like that. Valtteri didn't do a very good job of holding off Max Verstappen for too long. It was like 1.5 laps and then Max was gone. On the same tyres, don't forget. So that was a bit... What was that all about? Sergio Perez, who finished 9th, actually led the race for quite a long time. Did a pretty good job all day for Red Bull Honda. It kind of all fell away at the end as they went on to the intermediates in the wets, kind of as it would with Sergio. But he did a good job starting on the hard tyre and having a nice long run on that and getting, you could argue, the best from that. And Charles Leclerc in the other Ferrari also started on the hard tyre, as everybody did at the back, and did pretty well to get right up there into Alonso territory, not too far away from Fernando. But then there's a real mess at the end as Charles tried to struggle on the slicks in the wet, as he would, like Lando, and had to come in on the last lap to get intermediate, so it all fell away for him there. But, you know, it was one of those races where he didn't have a lot to lose, so I guess staying out was a gamble that Charles was prepared to take. And then 10th was George Russell. He did a really good job of holding down 3rd place in the early stages of the race. Another very good point-scoring race for George. You know, there were various stages of the Grand Prix when he was holding up quite a lot of cars behind him. I say holding up's not really the right word. Leading quite a lot of cars behind him, including Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez. And even though George was one of the first to stop for intermediates, another good call, he actually finished P10, nonetheless in the points, so well done for him. I think the die-hard Max Verstappen Red Bull fans will say, wow, this is another incredibly lucky win for Lewis Hamilton. The rain stopped even as he took the checkered flag, but it was just enough to get him the lead. But I think the rain also gave Max Verstappen that P2, and I don't think Max will be complaining about that at all. Starting from the back of the grid, he finished 2nd. Lewis Hamilton messed up qualifying, should have been an easy win for him, but eventually won the race. And Lando Norris, who was without doubt the star of the Russian Grand Prix, finished only 7th, but it was a valiant drive with a capital V. It was one of those drives, one of those days when you think, yeah, this is the making of a real superstar in Formula One in terms of the future. I've always felt that about Lando, to be honest, ever since his Formula 3 days, but now we're seeing it in its proper light in Formula One in a competitive team. So that was the Russian Grand Prix. Nice podium. That's Tom Mason there on the podium, number 2 mechanic on Lewis's car. Good to see the mechanics getting the glory as well. Well deserved for everybody. And Lewis Hamilton's 100th race. I guess the final comment has to be that if you're going to have a 100th win and you're Lewis Hamilton, it ought to be a race like that because he's won plenty of that sort of race in the past, and that is the sort of condition that he loves. So congratulations to him. It was a great race in the end, despite all those grid penalties. Let's have some more. See you soon.